Hi, welcome back to another TerranScapes video. This video is going to showcase the ocean boards that I've been working on before I pour the water. I thought it might be nice to take a little look at them before the water gets poured. It gives me an opportunity to check in on the customer's interest just before I pour the water so I can make a slight modification if needed. And gives you a sort of before-after look so you can get a sense of what the foundation looks like before I pour the water and some of the ideas I'm hoping to achieve with them. One of the customers is using them for a World War II theme and will be basically using them to model a D-Day landing or something similar on the French coastline. So I've taken a look at some pictures of the English Channel on the French shore to try to make sure that I capture some of the elements of that to make it as plausible as possible. So what I thought I would do is, before I really show you the boards themselves, is give you a quick look at one of the reference photos that I'm really trying to capitalize on for a guideline for them. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about the boards in a little bit more detail. So here's a shot of part of the French shoreline, and you can see some of that vegetation here in these corners here. And another thing to note, is that while the shoreline actually varies quite a bit on the French coast, there are plenty of sandy areas that we can use as a model, and of course this is where some of the troops will probably land, as scurrying up this is not going to be very easy. So this gives you one sense of the kind of effect I'm trying to model. Notice the very light colored water heading out, and then this darker line. That is something I'm going to be trying to emulate. And we can take a look at one more. Where is that file? That picture. These are some of the pictures that I have been collecting for shorelines, especially for France. And this is a really good shot of the kind of effect that I'm looking for. Now, one of the challenges, of course, is the scale, and this is a quite large patch of vegetation coming off of this shoreline, but I think I'll be able to, capture some of that effect. You can see it's got sort of a rough patch feel. Now it does have some larger blocks that are filled in, and I could add in a little bit of a denser area, but again the scale is a little bit odd, and so we may be thinking a little bit more of this area rather than these deeper areas. But you can tell, that this is a relatively consistent depth. I mean, obviously it's a little deeper out here, but this is kind of the idea of how vegetation grows, and this is going to be sort of the ideal area that I will be modeling for this. As a last thought before we leave this picture, you'll notice that the waves are actually relatively small. Oh, look at that. I didn't notice that before. So we're going to have to put some of this vegetation along the shoreline. But these waves are really, really quite small. So that gives me an opportunity to model these waves a little bit more easily rather than going for the very large cresting waves that I had been working on previously. So that gives you a look at some of the photos that I've been using to try to capture, to inspire me for the layout of these ocean boards, I should say. So just before we come in closer on the boards, I wanted to sort of give you an overview look of how they might tile and some of the major features from a bit of a distance. This is kind of the aerial view that I showed in the photo, and if you recall, I was discussing how there are patches of vegetation in the water, seaweed or seagrass or something similar. And so I wanted to try to capture that in the boards, and I'll show you a little bit more when we come up close, really how deep these will be in the water. But I've done them a little bit sporadically as I was, a little nervous about making them too dense, and I actually have to keep the band of them relatively thin because of the overall depth of the water, which is actually quite shallow. So if I make this quite broad, then some of it is going to be very, very close to the surface, and some of it is going to be very, very deep and hopefully will not be showing, as this area should be very close to opaque, very close to the bottom here. So I've decided to go with a fairly thin band, and a lot of plants in the oceans, have a very what am I thinking of? A very specific depth in the water that they grow. So this kind of models that idea that they're following a certain amount of depth in the water. Now I'm making this for two different customers, and so for the second customer, which has no specific theme, I wanted to take the opportunity to work on some really interesting rock formations in the water. In the past, I've put rocks along the shoreline, kind of bleeding into the water, and that was not as effective as I had hoped for, and sometimes the rocks were barely in the water, and it was not quite as plausible. Now, having grown up in Southern California, there's a little insight, off the La Jolla coast, the rocks were very dark colored, and so I wanted to try to capture that and give it a very deep reddish brownish color to give it a much more striking contrast and a little bit more, I think, plausibility than the typical gray rocks that you might find on most terrain, including my own, in a lot of different areas. And just as a final comment for you about close, so this represents a corner board, and here's a straight and another straight, and of course, I've done an inside corner as well, which has a little green shoreline like this, and then the whole area is ocean. So that gives you an overview of what the boards look like from a distance, and we'll come up close and I'll talk a little more about them. So just giving a quick little close-up of it. This is a new rock technique for me, both in painting and in formation. These are cast rocks in resin, backed by foam. There's a whole process in making these. I'm not going to go into it in this video, including the painting, but it is a very new technique, and I will probably describe it in the future in a little bit more detail. But what I've done is I've put that in, created some areas that are relatively flush with the surface of the ocean, and then added in some sand to kind of ground it into the surface. And I really think this is going to look very effective when the water is added. The vegetation is Silflora's horsetail vegetation, and this is a bit of a viney, sort of hairy plant, and I think it's going to look really well. I wanted to go with a very dark color so that it's quite muted, and what I'm looking for really is just a dark impression that there is something underneath the water representing plants. I won't know exactly how this works until I actually fill it with water, but I feel fairly confident, based on my previous experiences pouring oceans, that this is going to look quite right. And so this gives you a little bit look of the profile of the rocks. Now this is going to be above water in these areas here, as the water is going to come up to about this area, with some crashing waves coming up maybe a little bit higher. So I'm pretty excited about working with this, as it'll give me an opportunity to create some crashing waves along this area, and I think that's going to add some really nice visual interest to the boards. One of the things that I've been doing in laying in the vegetation and trying to keep them in a consistent depth is I actually made a template based on the shoreline edges that I've been cutting with the die cutter, and you can see some little marks across the top. And so my goal has been to keep the vegetation right along that first mark line, which will be the edge of the first water pour. Now, of course, because of the slope of the land, I've tried to create it somewhat unequal, and that varies from board to board. I'm having to, do a little estimation as to exactly where that depth will be in the center of the boards, but I feel fairly confident that I'll be able to judge that, that I have judged it, I should say, fairly accurately. And we'll take a quick look at that Silflora horsetail, and then we'll wrap this up. So taking a much closer look at this, what you can see is that it has a relatively low profile. I've kept it to just about 1/8 of an inch because the water is actually only going to come up about 1/4 of an inch total. And so I really want this to sit a decent amount below the surface. So I've actually sort of put it in at a pretty matted down level, again, because I'm looking for that impression. And I think that's going to work pretty well. And you can see here it's sort of it's fuzzy texture, as well as it's sort of viney. You can take a look at the horsetail Silflora foliage on the Scenic Express site if you're interested in it. It's an interesting material and it has a lot of different applications, but that gives you a little bit of a look at it. And here we can see a little bit of a close-up of the rock texture, as well as the painting technique. This is done with a series of washes rather than a series of dry brushes. The only thing that I was a little bit unhappy about is in trying to stain the sand. I actually gave the sand a wash and then I dry brushed it. Doesn't like that. There we go. You can see that it's bled a little bit onto the rocks and given it a little bit of a whitish hue. Here you can see I've gotten a little over in the dry brush. A bit tricky to work with the sand in here, but I'm hoping that this will not be really visible once I fill it with water. And of course there'll be some waves actually in some of these areas crashing over, and so that's probably going to obscure some of this as well. So I'm really going to be looking for the impression of sand that's collected in the rocks, basically due to the surf. So that gives you a little preview of the ocean boards and some of my thinking about how to go about achieving certain effects. I'm going to be pouring that in a series of layers, and people always ask me, how do I do that? I will be making a dam on all of the ocean sides that will be basically resin tight, and then I'll be pouring it in successive layers with lighter and lighter tints to the resin using in clear coat, which is sort of like Envirotex Light, and then that will create a shift in the color as it comes up to the top, and then the, as I mentioned before, the cast of the waves on the surface will be done in clear resin, and so that will be basically how I achieve a depth color heading up to the shore. So this is a new technique from the other ocean boards I've done. It does make me a little bit nervous because, you know, you're never quite sure how it's going to come out, but I have enough experience now that I think I should be able to anticipate the overall effect, and well, we'll all see in the end how it's going to come out. With that, I will join you again once I have poured the water and done the wave effects on top of it, and hopefully you will be interested in coming back to see that. And I just want to thank once again all the new subscribers, and thank you for taking the time to watch this. I really do appreciate it, and I will see you again in another TerranScapes video.